sure which one was harder and more annoying to do. Choosing the books that I wanted to talk about specifically in today's video out of all of the popular BOOKTOK books that I have read in the past and very much did not enjoy, or actually reading all of the books that we're going to be talking about in today's video. But either way, I did narrow it down, and today we're going to be talking about some popular BOOKTOK books that I wish I never read. So the first book that I wanted to talk about in today's video is Icebreaker by Hannah Grace. And the thing is that I had to go back to all of my reviews for these books to kind of try to remember the details of why I have such a passionately hating feeling towards them. And when I looked at my review for Icebreaker, I realized that it actually has 544 thumbs up, which I don't know if that's like my most liked review on Goodreads ever, because I don't actually check this stuff, but I had no idea that many people actually liked my review. And there happens to be a ton of comments underneath it. Like all of these comments underneath it are literally people like agreeing with me and things along those lines. So I decided that instead of me summarizing my really amazing review that I wrote that 544 people liked, I'm going to explain to you exactly why Icebreaker did not work for me and why I actually DNF'd to 50% in by literally just rereading my review that I had wrote for it. Alright, so to sum up my thoughts very quickly, there was way too much going on, and yet somehow at the same time absolutely nothing going on. So out of a weird mix of being extremely aggravated and also extremely bored, I ended up DNFing at 50% in. But in case you want some extra details, let's get into my actual review. So I should have realized right away that this book was not going to work for me when I was having a very hard time digesting the writing. There was just something that wasn't flowing very smoothly from the page into my brain, and therefore I was reading it extremely slowly, and I kept finding myself putting it down, which is always a very bad sign. Then on top of that, there was also so much info dumping for all of the side characters. It felt like she had already pre-planned out a multi-book companion series, and she was trying to get us to fall in love with all of these side characters because they're going to be getting future books. So therefore, she was giving all of them like an excessive amount of page time and sharing way too much information about them. And just to prove my point here with some details, we've got her best friend Liv, who's starting to get with his best friend Robbie, her skating partner Aaron, who's mentally and emotionally abusive to her, but she doesn't realize this even though she's been in therapy for years and is supposedly really good at expressing her thoughts and figuring out how she's feeling, but okay, whatever. Then there's also a bunch of guys from the hockey team that end up becoming a part of this large friend group that's forming. We have JJ, Henry, Russ, Bobby, plus more people. Did I forget to mention Robbie? Yeah, he's Anastasia, the main girl in the story's fuck buddy at the beginning of the book, because she doesn't have any interest in committing to a relationship because she just wants to focus on her training and skating career. But it's okay because early on, he ends up starting up a relationship with someone that Liv, Anastasia's best friend, absolutely hates. So now her and Robbie are just best friends who sleep in the same bed together sometimes without shirts on, and no big deal, that's not weird at all. Then there's Nate, who's the main guy in the story, and he was a sweetie and I did like him enough, but unfortunately not enough to keep on reading with the book, especially because I really could not stand Anastasia. And I have seen a lot of people say how it's like, well, it's a reverse Grumpy Sunshine and that's why she was a bit of an annoying character. And trust me, that was not the reason. I absolutely love the Grumpy Sunshine trope, and I do not mind it whatsoever when it's a reverse Grumpy Sunshine, personally because I am the grump in my Grumpy Sunshine real life relationship of sorts. So I can often very much relate to a grumpy character. But the way that she was being written into this specific type of trope just very much was not working for me, and I could not stand her. And then as for their relationship, I didn't like that either. It was a lot of telling and no showing, which is something that I always say I am not a fan of. Like, I really want to see why the relationship is being built up rather than just like the author telling me how they're feeling and why they're feeling that way or something along those lines. And then unfortunately, the few times that we actually did get a moment of showing where these two characters were alone for a moment together and we got to see them interacting on page, all they would do is get it on, which is like not what I want to see from my romance book. I would like to see a little bit of a build up as to why you're falling in love with each other and not just like getting it on because you guys are super attracted to each other. And then as for the actual plot line, there was none. Yup, none. At the beginning of the book, we get this moment where it's like there was something wrong with one of the ice skating rinks, so therefore the hockey team and then the skating people are going to have to share a rink for the next season, and that's kind of like the initial setup of why all of these characters meet, and it's just like a starting point for them to to all become friends all of a sudden. And then the rest of the book is literally just all of them doing mundane college stuff, like going to parties and bars and doing their homework and going to classes and things along those lines, like very boring everyday things that we just kept seeing over and over again. And then the funny thing is that right at the halfway point in the book is when we actually get the second half of what we had initially been told about in the synopsis, which is when Aaron, the abusive skating partner, ends up getting injured and blaming it on Nate, and therefore Nate ends up getting banned from playing for a little bit, and therefore he decides to fill in as Anastasia's skating partner, and that is right around the moment where I ended up giving up on the story. And I'm just gonna say, do not put something in the synopsis if it's only going to happen halfway through the book. In my personal opinion, I think that a synopsis should either be the first 50 to 100 pages of the story of just like telling us how the book is generally being set up, or giving us a general theme and idea of what we can expect from the story overall. And the way that this one was written, like the synopsis versus like when everything was showing up in the book, just made no sense to me. So anyway, to sum up this very lengthy review that I did not realize was going to take so long, there was too many characters, too much drama, and somehow there was nothing actually going on other than these people hanging out a bunch and Anastasia getting on with Nate every time she was drunk and horny. And it is crazy to say that I actually had so much more that I could have possibly shared in this review, but then it was getting too long, so I just like didn't. I just feel like that was so much information, and yet I still somehow had more. So I am going to stop myself here, also because I did read this book so long ago that I honestly can't remember too many of the details of what else I wanted to share, but just know that that was only like the tip of the iceberg of what was bugging the hell out of me with this book, and that is more or less why I completely do not understand what everybody on BookTok was going crazy over for this book. Like, it was so freaking popular, and that was really the only reason why I ended up picking it up, and then oh my god, did I end up being disappointed. Alright, so next up I wanted to talk about Meet Me Halfway by Lillian T. James. So what sucks about this book is that I think that if I did pick it up at a different time in my life without prior knowledge about some other books, I do think that I would have very much enjoyed it. So I'm not fully hating on BookTok for recommending this book, but I am specifically hating on specific people who did push this book, because I do know that they have read other books that ended up turning me off from this book, and therefore I don't understand why they didn't see what I saw in it. And the main thing that I'm really talking about is the fact that this was like a carbon copy of Wait for It by Mariana Zapata. Like, there were so many details about this book that I won't bother getting into in like while we're talking here, because I did talk about it in my Goodreads review in great length, but I just kept reading this book and I'm like, okay, well, this feels like Wait for It, and this feels like Wait for It, and this is a scene that happened in Wait for It, and this is a moment that happened in Wait for It, and this is characteristics of the main characters in Wait for It, and it was just like building up on top of building up, and I'm like, literally, you couldn't have just like written something similar but yet different. It just was way too similar for me, and that's why the entire time I was reading it, I was just getting more and more annoyed as like how similar it was. And I will say that yes, this can probably, you know, relate to the fact that I had recently read Wait for It by Mariana Zapata a couple of books before I ended up picking this book up, but I mostly picked it up because I had such a good time with Wait for It, and I'm like, look, I want to read something similar to that. I just don't want to reread Wait for It again right away. So that's why I picked this one up, and then I'm like, okay, well, I should have just read Wait for It then if I was gonna just reread it, but in a worse version. So yeah, this book wasn't necessarily a horrible book. Like, I do see why people had enjoyed it, except I unfortunately couldn't enjoy it because of all the bad vibes I was getting off, in the sense of like literally straightforward copying from one of my favorite books of all time, which is Wait for It by Mariana Zapata. And then just saying on top of that, Garrett, the main guy in the book, I think that's what his name was, he was definitely giving me bad vibes. Like, he was trying to be like Dallas, but he definitely wasn't, and I found him to be a little bit of a creep. So anyway, yeah, this book just definitely didn't work for me, and it really did piss me off because I was just so upset about how like straightforward copying it was to Wait for It, and how nobody else had said anything about that. And I know that the people who were pushing the book had read Wait for It, so I just don't see why they didn't see what I saw. All right, let's calm down a little bit over here. I think I'm getting a little bit heated with all of the passionate amount of hate that I have. So next up, I wanted to talk about Love in Other Words by Christina Lauren. So this is a book that I very distinctly remember picking up because of BookTok. I actually had it sitting on my shelf for a very long time. I was in like a Christina Lauren phase for a while, and I was picking up all of her books anytime that like I had seen them around. And this was just one that I never ended up like physically picking up after I added it to my shelf. And then it kind of went like viral on a BookTok for a minute, minute there, and I was like, you know what? Everybody seems to like be crying over it and absolutely loving it. Why don't I give it a shot? I couldn't remember the reason why I kept pushing it off. So I did give it a shot, and I'm pretty sure made like an entire reading vlog about it. So I'll try to find that and link it down below. But either way, what I remember from hating about this book is kind of everything about it. So I am a big fan of Christina Lauren books. So I did initially connect to their writing. I am a big fan of their writing, but this was actually one of the initial books that made me realize that not only am I not a fan of second chances, but I'm also not a fan of dual timelines. And I am especially not a fan of dual timelines when both characters know what happened between the two of them, but we don't find out until the end of the book. Like, I don't like how the third act, Big Boom, is finding out what they had known this entire time. Like, it's almost as if you finish the book and now you're like, okay, well now let's go reread the entire thing so that we can understand how they were feeling in all of the moments throughout literally the entire book. And what I really didn't like about this story was what actually happened to make them break up, to then have an 11-year separation to get us back to the beginning of the book where this entire story actually started. Like, in this book, if you're not familiar, you're following two people who they were best friends as children, and they actually started dating as children, and then something happened. They ended up just like separating for 11 or so years, and then they bump into each other in the future, and then they try to give each other a second chance, or like he wants a second chance, or she's like, you know, very upset with what happened, so she's like, nah, go away, and then obviously she's gonna end up giving in. And then you're basically following a dual timeline of getting to see them in the past and then also getting to see them in their present as they're getting their second chance. And there is just so much about that that very much doesn't work for me. I will say though, is that I can see why people enjoy this book. Obviously, I'm in the minority here of not enjoying this book because a lot of people absolutely love it and it's some of their favorite books. But there is just so many like basic things about this book that just does not work for me. And I really don't want to get into detail because I have gotten into like a bit of trouble saying it in the past of like what I didn't like about this book. So if you did want to hear why in very great detail this book didn't work for me, I would just recommend watching my vlog that I had made about it, even though I made that a very long time ago. So don't judge my like vlogging skills because it was one of my earlier videos on my channel. But either way, all I'm gonna say is that I absolutely hated this book and I very much did regret reading it. Like, I just like, once I was like halfway through the book, I realized I'm like, okay, like I have a feeling about where this is going and I'm not liking it. I should stop myself here. But I didn't, and I kept going, and then I very much did end up regretting it. And anytime I look at this book, I just get extremely bothered for so many reasons. So yeah, this is another very popular BOOKTOK book that I really wish I just never read. All right, so next up, we're gonna talk about the Broken Bond series. So this is, I believe, a 6-book series, and I ended up making it either 4.5 books in or 5.5 books in. No, that doesn't make sense. I did make it 4.5 books in. I ended up DNFing it halfway through the 5th book, and there was only a book and a half left before the ending, and I literally couldn't care less, and that is why I literally just put it down, because I'm like, I've had way more than enough. So if you're not familiar with this series, this is a, what would you call it? Like a dystopian-y series of sorts, or like, I don't know, but either way, it's a reverse harem story. So you have this one girl, and she is like the Bond to all these other guys. So in this universe, there's like these people who have specific powers of sorts, and it also works in like a soulmate-y thing, whereas like there's this one person in the center, and then she has many soulmates. So it's kind of like how the reverse harem comes into like the basis of this fantasy world. And then on top of that, there's like magic-y stuff going on. So maybe it's like an urban fantasy or dystopian fantasy. I don't know how to categorize it, and it honestly doesn't really matter. But either way, right when I started this, I'm like, okay, this could be a lot of fun. I was in like my reverse harem mood at the time, and I'm like, I could get down with all of this. There was a lot of different dynamics going on with like an enemies to lovers and a hate to love and like a sweetie pie golden retriever. Like, there was a lot of guys we were dealing with, and it was kind of fun. But then as I kept going, I kept getting more and more annoyed because, I mean, look, at the end of the day, this is kind of probably my fault, but reverse harems, why they don't end up working for me is because they're just way too heavy on the sex and way too little on the plot. And I wish that there was a little bit more balance. Like, I am down for the reverse harem if we also had a very substantial plot line to like bring us along while they're not actually getting it on. But unfortunately, the more and more this series went on, the more and more they kept getting on because there was like 5 guys and she had to keep having sex with all of them. So then the plot line ended up like getting pushed to the back burner, and we were only getting like the bare minimum of what we needed. And I just kept wishing for like more and more information. And I'm like, build this up a little bit more. Give me some more detail here. This isn't making sense. This is counteracting the information you gave me here. And it was just like building on top of each other of like, there were so many inconsistencies and so many unanswered questions. And way too much sex for me, that the more and more I went, I just kept, enjoying it less and less and less. And there was a lot more to it than that. I mean, I read 4.5 books and I had like very lengthy reviews for every single one of them. But at the end of the day, that was more or less the gist of how I felt about the Broken Bond series and why I did end up DNFing it. And look, do I regret my time reading it? Definitely yes. But am I happy that I checked it out to just see what it was about, because I was very intrigued by it and I really wanted to know if I was going to absolutely love it or if it wouldn't work for me? I am happy that I did check it out because of that, because I definitely was feeling that. But unfortunately, it didn't work for me, and I'm a little bit upset that I wasted so much of my time with it, because at around probably like somewhere in the second book, I started realizing where this was going and how it was going to keep going, and I really wish I had stopped myself early, because it was just going to keep on bothering me, and I knew it subconsciously, and yet I kept going for like 3.5 more books. So next up, very similarly to my issues with the Broken Bond series, is the Savage Land series by Stacey Marie Brown. So funny thing is I actually had read Broken Bonds first, and then I'm like, look, I want to do fantasy. I want like the romance aspect in it as well. So let me see what BOOKTOK has to offer me. And this was one that was very hyped up. So I'm like, you know what? Let's give it a shot. It sounds quite interesting. So if you are not familiar with this, you are following like some sort of dystopian world where fairies lived in like a different world that was like parallel to ours. And somehow there was like a meeting point, and now they're both living in the same area, like humans and fairies / magical creatures or something like that. And at the beginning of this book, you're following this girl who is like, I think part of like the army or something like that. I don't know, but she ends up getting in trouble and gets sent to jail. And this is a jail that has many different creatures. So there's like fairies and whatever other creatures are in this world. And she's going to end up having to like try to survive in this crazy jail that is known for no one ever leaving unless they are actually dead. So just hearing that alone, I'm like, oh my God, this sounds like it could be an amazing, amazing story. So unique, so different, so intriguing. And I'm like, yes, let's get into it. And then unfortunately, it didn't end up working out. And I did end up DNFing the series after finishing book 1. So what were some of my issues with it? Well, first of all, the writing, very weird writing. I can't remember the details of like what actually bothered me with it, but there was just something about it that like every time it kept coming up in the book, I'm like, stop. Like just write it a little bit more normally. And then on top of that, I really didn't like this girl. There was a lot of inconsistencies in her actual like personality. Like at one moment she was like this, and then one moment she was like pretending to be this way. And I'm just like, okay, well, who are you? I don't think even you know, but you're acting so like, all full of yourself that you feel like you do know who you are. So it was just really confusing, like main character sort of thing. And then on top of that, we had a really weird like romantic situation going on. There was like an enemies to lovers sort of thing-ish. I don't know. There was like this guy in the prison that was like the scariest guy in the entire prison, and he ends up being like pulled to her for some reason, and like he keeps trying to kill her, and then every time like she's literally in like an I'm almost gonna die situation, she started getting really horny, and then all of a sudden there was all this sexual tension. Like just the way that the romance was being like trickled into this actual series made no sense to me, and I'm like, this is the wrong time to be turned on. Like why are you like feeling these feelings in this moment? It made no sense to me. And honestly, there was a lot more about this book that really just wasn't working for me, especially with like the world building of sorts. I'm like, this sounds like such a cool world and a universe and idea that you came up with, and you are not building it up enough. And then what sucks is that I did talk to my friend about this, who was a big fan of this series, and I'm like, look, this is all of the issues that I'm having so far. Is it going to get better? Should I keep going? Because sometimes series do get better as you go. Sometimes you just gotta like, trickle through the first book and it will get better later on. And she's like, if you're having these issues, it's kind of gonna keep going. Like it's gonna be very heavy on the romance and not really explain in as great of detail as you're looking for the world building. And I'm like, why can't it balance itself out a little bit? Like same thing with the Broken Bonds. When sometimes these people try to put in like a very heavy romance into a fantasy book and make it steamy but also give us fantasy, they just rely too much on the actual romance and trying to pull in the sexual tension and the sex scenes and things along those lines, and therefore they forget about the actual world building. But it's like, I really want both, and I want it to be a nice balance, and unfortunately this one was not giving me that. So that is why I do regret wasting my time reading the first book, because I feel like there was potential and then it ended up letting me down, and now I'm just annoyed that it didn't hit the level that I wanted to hit. And it's something that's very irksome to me, Okay, I gotta calm down again. I'm getting way too excited about all of this. But next up, I wanted to talk about People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, which I probably should have talked about right after Love and Other Words, because a lot of the reasons why I didn't like People We Meet on Vacation is the same reason as Love and Other Words. And this is one of those initial books that really made me realize what does and does not work for me, specifically with second chances, dual timelines, and the idea of both characters knowing why they have the issue that they have the entire book and we only find out in like the third act conflict of sorts. And what sucked about this book specifically with that general layout is that once we found out why the two characters in People We Meet on Vacation wasn't talking for a couple of years, that made the present timeline of sorts come together where they're going to give each other a second chance of sorts. Once we found out that thing that both of them knew the entire time, it was so underwhelming that I'm like, why did I read this whole book just to find out that? Like, that is why you guys didn't talk for this whole time? Oh my God, miscommunication up the wall. Drove me absolutely insane. But then on top of that, I actually found this book to be much more boring than I thought it was. Like, I feel like right when Emily Henry's book started coming out, like now she's a little bit like more well known of like what type of book she is. But I had read this literally like right when it had come out. So it was a couple of years ago. And basically I remember just being like, where is the romance in here? Like, this is way too fiction-y for me and not heavy enough on like romances and interactions of sorts. And also on top of that, it was so heavily based in the past. Like, we were getting so much of like how their friendship started and why they got to the point where they got right before they actually broke up and then came back together. And I just think that when you're dealing with dual timelines and second chances, you really gotta balance it out very equally. And this definitely didn't feel balanced to me. Like, I don't think that people should get a second chance just based off of their actual past. You really have to build it up for me in the present day as well. And here, all it felt like was like, look, they have this amazing past. Something tiny, tiny, tiny happened that you're gonna find out at the end of the book. And now they're giving each other a second chance because they finally like talk to each other after all this time of just like literally ignoring each other for whatever reason. So it's just like the way that the entire book was laid out wasn't working for me. There also wasn't enough romance in it for me, which now I feel like is on my part because Emily Henry kind of is now more well known to be like, look, she's like a fiction writer with a good romance, but it's like a very specific style and it's not just like heavy on the romance. So that was on me. But at the time when Emily Henry was just like just building up her popularity, that wasn't as well known. And therefore that is the reason why People I Meet on Vacation very much didn't work for me and I ended up being very disappointed. And honestly, I only really picked it up because like, look, Emily Henry was getting all of this buzz and I'm like, okay, well, she's coming out with a new book. Beach Read wasn't horrible, but not my favorite, but maybe this one will be better. And then unfortunately, it wasn't better. And that is why I kind of do regret my time reading People We Meet on Vacation. So I ended up talking way too much about each of the books in today's video, so I feel like I should cut this a little bit short and only talk about one last book, even though I had a handful more that I did want to add to this video, but I feel like it's becoming excessively long for no reason. So this is the last one I'm going to talk about, but if you have been enjoying this video, then let me know down in the comment section below because I can definitely, without a doubt, make a part 2 because, oh my God, do I have a lot more popular books that did not end up working for me. But either way, with that said, the last book that I'm going to be talking about in today's video is Haunting Adeline by H.D. Carlton. So I actually did DNF this book 50% in, but I had a very good reason for it. And I actually have an entire review that I wrote about it. And I feel like instead of myself getting off topic like I have in this entire video, we're just going to get straight to the point and reread the review that I originally wrote because I feel like it was quite on point of how I felt about this story and why I ended up DNFing it. I'm not a big fan of incest or instant obsession, so I was having a very hard time connecting with Zaid because of that, as well as the romance in general, specifically from his side of things. And then I also wasn't enjoying the naivety and stubbornness in Adeline, and therefore it was making me have a very hard time connecting with her as well. And then on top of that, I also wasn't a fan of the whole like history repeating itself sort of thing, like with her grandmother. I just found it to be like not necessarily very random, but like very unnecessary. I also didn't like how many inconsistencies there were in the characters' personalities slash actions. Like, I was well aware of what type of book I was getting myself into. I looked up all of the trigger warnings. I knew what the book was going to be about more or less. But then realistically, it ended up making no sense to me. Like, how can your life mission be to track down rapists and pedophiles and sex traffickers and literally kill them, but then literally also be the same thing? Like, you were literally a stalker that tracked down your prey, raped her, and then justified it by saying that like she really wants it, she's just not yet ready to admit it. Like, that is literally what every single rapist says. And it just didn't make any sense to me realistically. Like, it would have made more sense if he was just like a crazy psycho killer and decided to like stalk Adeline and then like rape her and then eventually they would fall in love and you brought in this sex trafficking sort of situation in a different way. That would have made more sense. But the way that this was going down was just like baffling my mind. I'm like, this makes absolutely no sense. Like, if you're a human being living in this real world, how do you justify what you're doing when you literally spend your entire life being who you are tracking down, you know? And then at that point, I was more or less like halfway through the first book and I just wasn't connected to the characters. I wasn't really enjoying where the romance was going. I wasn't enjoying the plot. And I feel like the whole thing was dragging really hard. And I also kind of more or less knew where the storyline was going because I had seen a lot of people read it and I kind of just knew like snippets of like what was going to happen. And I honestly like wasn't down to see where it was going to go. So that is why I gave up on it early. But I kind of really wish that I could have gotten down with it a little bit more than I did. Like I wish I could have connected with the main characters more. I wish that I was like down for the dark vibes the way that they were going down. But unfortunately, it wasn't working for me. And that's why I DNF'd it. And I don't really regret my decision doing that. I do think though that if I would have read it via audio, I might have enjoyed it more because maybe the writing wouldn't have turned me off as much. And maybe I just like would have listened to it like, you know, very casually and I wouldn't have been like, oh my gosh, this is such a thick book and it's taking forever to get down and it's just dragging it. It wouldn't have bothered me as much. But this is the way that I did read it. And I now have like no interest in going back to it and trying it via audio. So that is more or less that. But do I regret my time reading it? Kind of. Am I happy that I did try it though? Yes, so that I did know what it was actually about and knowing that it didn't work for me so that I could just like cross it off my list of forever being curious about it. So anyway, with that said, that is everything that I'm going to be sharing with you for today's video, but I did have a lot more that I did want to share. So if you do want to see me make a part 2 of this, let me know down in the comment section below. And also if you did enjoy it, then please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you're not currently subscribed, because I would really appreciate it. But either way, I just appreciate you taking the time to watch. So thank you so much for that. And with that said, until next time, enjoy reading.